So I'm Matt Smith. I'm the Sustainable Ag and Food Systems Agent for Sumter, Pasco, and Hernando County. So today we'll be going over just kind of a basic overview of pre-emergent herbicides for Central Florida strawberry production. So we'll start off going over just the basic high level, what are pre-emergent. Then we'll go into a brief kind of review into weed identification. That's going to be really important in selecting which chemicals we're going to use. We'll talk a little bit about pre-emergent timing because you do need to time these things properly to make sure they're going to be at their most effective. We'll talk about some strawberry pre-emergence in particular, and then we'll talk about some fresh research. I spoke to Dr. Boyd over at a research station outside of Plant City and got some fresh research from him. So we can kind of talk about some of the new stuff coming out. But first off, we'll go over, all right, so what are these pre-emergent herbicides? So unlike what you may be more used to with post-emergence, a pre-emergent targets that weed before it grows above the surface. With germinating actual weed seed, it's going to be a little barrier that forms just below the soil layer. Whenever those seeds open up and they germinate, they're going to hit that layer of pre-emergent and it's going to kill them before they even ever come up. So it's a little bit different strategy from a post-emergent where you wait for it to be above the ground, then you got to spot spray it or something like that. Like with the post-emergent, like a gramoxone or a Roundup or a 2,4-D, different pre-emergents are going to target different kinds of weeds. So whether it be grasses, broadleaves, and sedges. And the other important thing about pre-emergents is that these work best with annuals because we really are talking about anything that goes to seed and that seed below the ground germinating and hitting that layer pre-emergent. It doesn't work generally as well with perennials that may have some kind of stored energy source that they can use to continually push throughout the season. First, we'll go over Weed ID 101. Again, it's important that we match our weeds to the proper kind of chemical treatment. Otherwise, you're just going to be spending money spraying chemicals that aren't going to do anything there. And we are really trying to reduce overall pesticide usage and make sure we're really targeting what it is that we actually have out in the field. So weeds are broken up into three main categories: grasses, broadleaves, and sedges. Starting out with grasses, this is an example of a grass. Whenever you're looking at your weed, you want to look for parallel veins so you can kind of see them running along. So you got that center vein that you see in most leaves, but instead of branching out from the middle, you see it runs parallel to that center line. That's going to be a classic sign for grasses. The stems themselves are going to be round and they're going to be hollow. So if you roll them between your fingers, you're not going to feel any kind of edges on them. The blades also are longer than they are wide. So your main examples, you're going to see this: crabgrass, goosegrass, and torpedo grass. An example of goosegrass right here. Cotton grass, bluegrass, torpedo grass, any of these generally are going to be considered weed grasses. The one I see a lot in the field, though, are your goosegrasses and your crabgrasses. Next ones are going to be broadleaf. But these are ones that are kind of net-like veins. So you'll have that center main structure like you have in the grass, but instead of those veins going parallel to that center line, you see they kind of like branch out. And then they branch out even further from there to form that kind of sort of net. So there's any kind of like leaf. If you think of classic leaf in your head, that's going to be a broadleaf. You'll also, these are the ones usually you see flowers on. This is an example of one that says Palmer's amaranth. Out in that field, though, the ones you see a lot, I mean, some chickweed, but really Florida and Brazilian pusley are really major ones. Dollarweed, although dollarweed you can usually take care of if we get our irrigation under control. Usually dollarweed is only going to be in a really, really wet area. It's going to be a pain if it gets set in an area, so you got to watch out for it. But usually we can control this, maybe with a spray of something, but that's what we can control ahead of time by just making sure we're not keeping our ground saturated. Duckweed is a pretty common one. Black nightshade, really common in Florida strawberries. The creeping beggarweed, not as much usually. Last one of these three are sedges. So the sedges, again, they'll look pretty similar to a grass. The leaves themselves actually can look fairly similar with that single mid vein, and they may even see some parallel branching on it. The big differences are, one, you're going to look for leaf clusters and clusters of three, and also the stems themselves. So instead of being hollow and round like you would in a grass, these are going to be solid and triangular. It may also be indicators of wet sites. So if we look actually on the next slide, we can see, so this is what it would actually look up really close up. You can see that it is, one, triangular, and two, it's actually really kind of solid looking inside. So mainly you're going to see these in yellow and purple nutsedge are going to be the ones that are going to be the most prevalent in the field. These are those ones that when they come out of the ground, those leaves of three are all together in a solid kind of point, and they have a really good job penetrating through a lot of our plastic mulches. So those are the sedges. Those are the really annoying ones. They're also really annoying because they're perennials. And you can see on this, this is purple nutsedge here, because these things right here we're looking at aren't the leaves. So these are the rhizomes. So these are the roots, basically. So this plant, it stores a lot of energy in these rhizomes. And each of these little rhizomes is capable of sending up more leaves. So it can be really difficult because even if we pull it, it just signals to the plant, okay, we got all these energy reserves and these rhizomes, let's send up another. If you were to till and cultivate it, you cut all these up. Now you got a bunch of different ones, and they're all going to try to shoot up their own leaves. So the nutsedges are ones that usually you're not going to be able to take care of with a single application. You're going to need to have multiple attacks, multiple applications, however you're trying to get rid of them. Key thing though is to get them when they're first coming up and growing. And we'll talk a bit more about controlling these a little later on. That's yellow nutsedge. Okay, so now we'll talk about application timing with pre-emergence. And again, with pre-emergence, we're mainly using these to control our annual grasses and broadleaves. We'll talk about some fumigation techniques a little later on for trying to control a bit of the sedges. You want to apply these before the weed seeds actually germinate. So timing, again, is pretty critical. We want to time our application based on when about we think the weeds are actually going to pop up out of the soil. And we're going to do that based on temperature. You'll see some guides that'll tell you, based on a certain time of year or date, but really the key thing on here is temperature. You also are going to need adequate soil moisture to activate it. So a lot of these pre-emergents on the label, they'll tell you, it may need half an inch or a quarter inch or something of watering in before it's really activated and ready to work. Generally, these products are effective for controlling weeds like 6 to 12 weeks after application. And then you usually want to do an additional application 6 to 9 weeks after that initial one. That'll give you full scale coverage. Obviously, if you're doing this underneath the plastic, you may not be able to do that additional application, but certainly if you're trying to control weeds in the row middles, between the rows, this would really take effect. The timing wise, mainly for strawberry growers, because we are growing under a plastic mulch, we're going to be doing our initial application either right after cultivation. So after we till the soil and we bed it up, before we put, if we're doing it in the row, we're going to do it, right before we put the plastic over it. If we are just doing in between the rows though, it depends. So if you are not going to be using bare roots, strawberry transplants, you're using plugs, you're not worrying about that watering in kind of period, then you're looking more in terms of between the rows when those seeds are going to be germinating. And usually it's going to be in Central Florida, late October to early November. Or when those night temps, this is really the key one here, we're talking about temperature, when those night temps drop to 55 degrees to 60 degrees Fahrenheit for about 4 to 5 consecutive days. And that usually happens in late October to early November. If you are using bare root transplants though, for your strawberries, then you have those like couple of weeks where you're watering them in. If you have any pre-emergent herbicide down before then, all of that amount of water, that's way too much water. and you're going to wash all that away. So generally speaking, if you're going to be doing any kind of bare root transplants, you want to wait until after that watering in phase is done, then apply your pre-emergent between the rows, and then go ahead and water that in. That'll provide you protection for, depends on the product, how many weeks or so. And then you'll go through the winter, and now you're looking at the spring season. So generally speaking, we want to apply our spring season pre-emergence around February 15th. And it's really when our day temps, get between 65 and 70 degrees for about 4 to 5 consecutive days. You really want to watch the weather on this one. We've had some weird winters over the past few years. Last one was the first one I can think of in a while that you would consider normal, So we've definitely had some times where it gets, warmer, to this level, 65 to 70 degrees before that, and the real key there is that warm temperature for 4 or 5 consecutive days. That's going to be the signal to the, any kind of weed seed in there, but it's going to be time for it to, to jump up and start producing more weeds. So we want to target before that actually happens. Usually it's going to be around February 15th. The strawberry pre-emergence in particular. So you have products that exist for both the in-row application, so under the plastic, as well as within the row middles as well. Some of those fumigants that we use to control, root knot nematode, and even some fungal infections, they can also help control weeds. It's one of the few ones we had that really helped to control yellow and purple nutsedge. They can also take out some unfriendly bacteria as well. You can use fumigants, along with the root knots. They can take care of fusarium, for example, bacteria that cause bacteriosphoria, things like that. So one little key thing here. So we want to remember with our pre-emergent herbicides, just as with our post-emergent ones, or even with our insecticides, rotation is absolutely key here. We want to rotate, again, by that mode of action, not just that product brand or the active ingredient. And you find that on the very top of your pesticide label. So remember that using that single mode of action, that's only going to wipe out all but the resistant weeds to that mode of action. So if you've wiped all those out, next season, where do you think all those seeds are coming from? They're going to be the ones that are a bit more resistant, and that probably is not going to be as effective as it was the first time. And if you do that season over season over season, you are selecting for resistant weeds. So we want to rotate that. For sedges, a pre-plant here, fumigation is an option. So again, like one single product usually isn't going to be enough on these to really cause full effect. So we want to do a full system. The ones that UF recommends right now is a 3-way system consisting of telone 2, which is really popular, particularly for nematode suppression, and then also chloropyracin, and then either KPAM or VAPAM also can provide good to really excellent control. Key thing with the KPAM and the VAPAM, you want to apply that either with a mini culture rig, so really kind of small little light tiller, or if you're going to do it using the drip irrigation, you want to have 2 drip lines going across the bed, and that'll give you nice full bed coverage. It's going to be the most effective way to do it. With any fumigants, we've really found, particularly on the sandy soils, we want to apply those when the soil temperature, it's not the air temperature, but the soil temperature is above 68 degrees Fahrenheit. And the soil moisture, you want to get to about 14% in a sandy soil. And those conditions provide the best ability for that liquid chemical to convert into a gas and actually fumigate within the soil. Another alternative option that that trifecta system with the telone is Paladin, which is a dimethyl disulfide, and you're going to co-apply that with chloropyracin. That one is it's a newer product, but it is showing a good deal of promise. There are some non-chemical options here for controlling sedges that I want to just kind of bring up. Um, so you can consider using, instead of your standard plastic mulch, which is usually considered a VIF, a virtually impermeable, or a low density film, using a totally impermeable film. I say totally impermeable. This is mainly the kind of one that we would use for a lot of fumigants. For Paladin, it's actually required that you use it. It's just a thicker plastic, and it has kind of shown to better inhibit that nutsedge from being able to pierce that plastic layer and come on up. And as long as we can keep those plants from being able to get into the sunlight, they're having to rely solely on the energy that is stored within those rhizomes. So we can deplete them. And that's kind of one of the keys with taking care of sedges, is depleting all of the energy in that rhizome. So that impermeable membrane film is one way we can do that. Another way to do it, particularly with the sedges. So remember I told you earlier that those sedges, those rhizomes, if you cut them up, each of them is independently capable of sending up a whole new plant. Well, yes, they are, but they're going to be much weaker because you're talking about, instead of a whole complex of rhizomes, we're talking about little tiny pieces of rhizomes that each individually have much less energy within them. So once you do harvest and you pull everything up, if you have a nutsedge issue, you can cultivate that soil, just go through and till it. And then you want to wait for those sedges to reemerge and let them get about, 2-3 inches or so. You want them to be actively growing. And once you see that, go ahead and spray a post-emergent herbicide, like a Roundup. Roundup's pretty effective because it's systemic. It actually goes into the plant. It actually goes into those rhizomes. And that will really, really weaken that plant because, again, it doesn't have a lot of energy to draw off on anymore. And then immediately after you do that, go ahead and plant some kind of broadleaf cover crop, one that really effectively, because broadleaf cover crops, they really do a really good job of shading that soil. So now you've cut up those rhizomes, you've given them a fresh blast of like a Roundup, and then you planted a cover crop over them to shade them. You're really weakening their sources, weakening them and taking away a lot of their sources of energy. You do so for a couple of seasons, and you can really effectively control your sedges. Favorite thing too, aside from sedges, any of your broadleafs, which is kind of just talking about prevention right now. Anything that's going to be going to seed, as long as you can take care of that before it goes to seed, that is an incredibly effective way to decrease your weed pressure the next year, because that single plant can produce literally thousands of seeds, and you're going to have to deal with those the next year. They're not going to blow all away. So, weed management is a whole cycle. It's a year-long investment. But if you follow all those steps, you can really reduce the amount of labor in weeding the next year and the amount of herbicides that you have to use that next season as well. So these are the products that we recommend for pre-emergence for strawberries. And this information is available online, but I've gone ahead and gone through and just cut out the ones that were all pre-emergent. So if you want to like take a screenshot or something like that, it's mainly 4 chemicals that we look at. So Chateau, which I've never used in strawberries, but I have used with tomatoes and I think hops one time. It's very effective. The big thing about these, and what I want you to kind of focus on these, is that we are looking at the modes of action. So if you had a Chateau, you wouldn't want to follow it up like, say, you could do like a Chateau in the fall, and then you could do a Devenorol in the spring, because these are different modes of actions. But you wouldn't want to follow up the Chateau with the Galligan or the Goal, because they are both the same modes of action. They're both mode of action code 14. So even though these are different brand names and they are different active ingredients, the method by which they kill the target pest is the same. And that's where you see resistance, is to the method of killing it. So you want to be sure to rotate out between these. So you could do like, a Chateau in the fall or the spring, and you could do a Prowl and the other one as well. So keeping in mind that you do want to rotate these to ensure that you are getting coverage of, it's very rare for a single plant to have a genetic resistance to two modes of actions, basically statistically impossible. So by rotating those modes of actions, we ensure that these chemicals are still going to be useful for a long period of time. And so the last thing we'll really talk about today is some fresh takes. So one of the nice things about being an extension is I get to work closely with all of our researchers. And I talked to Dr. Boyd, who's out of our Gulf Coast Research and Education Station, and his main specialty is in strawberry weed management. So I gave him a call a couple weeks ago and asked him if he had any new studies that were coming out or some ones that had just been published he thought that might be good for this class. So there's two in particular that I want to talk about. So this first one came out in the journal Weed Technology. It was accepted on October 5th, 2020. I think it's out yet, but I'm not certain if it's actually out yet, but it's been accepted on here. So this one is based off 3 research trials conducted in Balm, which is our research station, and another one in Dover, Florida. It was in 2017 and 18. And they're looking at tolerance of mainly the strawberry cultivar Radiance to that pre-emergent herbicide Chateau. So it's the one right here on the very top. Again, this is a very, very popular pre-emergent. So they applied it at different rates, and they're trying to figure out, one, what is going to be the rate, at which there's potential crop harm associated with its over application, and 2, they wanted to see how long it really persisted in the soil. So looking at these 2 trial sites, they found that Chateau did persist throughout the growing season for like a solid 150 days, and with no reduction in soil concentrations. This was still extremely effective at controlling pre-emergent weeds. They also found that, again, keeping to the label rate, this is a very safe product to use with strawberries. It was only when they used 8 times the label rate and above that they actually saw economic damage to the strawberry harvest. One thing that they did note, though, again, they found that this was very persistent in the soil for 150 days. And because it persisted so well for so long, they did recommend that if you're going to relay crop on this, so if you're going to plant, vegetable crops, squashes and things like that in these same beds, either during the strawberry harvest season or immediately afterward, if you want to double crop into it, you need to be cautious because there could still be some residual activity which may damage the fresh young transplant that you're putting into the ground to grow up that second crop. So just keep that in mind. If you are planning to do that, that may be a case where you may want to use Chateau for your fall application and then use a product with a different mode of action for your spring that may not have as long of a residual period. The second one is looking at the fumigant Capam. And they wanted to see how effective it was on 7 weed species, and then also root knot nematodes, Fusarium, and this guy here, this Macrophomia thessaliana. This is what actually causes Botrysphaeria, damping off, things like that. So what they were looking at was at different label rates, because they'll give you, a spectrum. What is this product controlling? How well is it actually controlling it? So they did find that applications at the label rate was sufficient to control all of the studied fungi, weed, and nematodes. But they found that there were ideal levels of different rates for controlling different pests. So they actually found that if they had a rate below that label rate, in some areas significantly below the label rate, they were still able to capably control the root knot nematodes. That was the lowest level. It was only I think 68 grams per hectare, something like that, or kilograms per hectare. and I can't do the mathematics on the top of my head, but it's much lower than the label rate. Controlling those root-knot nematodes as well as most of the weeds. So the black nightshade, the wild spinach and goosefoot, common purslane or duckweed, there's just different common names for them. The goosegrass and the Brazilian puzzle. At a rate below the label rate, these were all controlled very well. As far as the fungi and bacteria, so the Fusarium and the Botryosphaeria, and also the weed hop clover, these were controlled at label rates, but at the low end of the spectrum. Where they really needed that higher label rate was particularly to control the weed Carolina geranium. So the conclusion of this research, and again, this one is just come out, is that if you are going to use KPAM, at the label rate, it does control a really good range of pests. However, you can use reduced rates, but only if these difficult control pests are not present. So if you do have a history in your field with Fusarium or Botryosphaeria, you do want to make sure that you're at those label rates. You got something harder to control like Carolina geranium, or especially something even harder like a nutsedge kind of deal, then you are going to want to use a full rate of the product. And that's about it. I mean, I promise you this is going to be a pretty short kind of overview presentation. This is some of the areas that I got a lot of documentation from. So we do have our EDIS documents on managing purple and yellow nutsedge in Florida strawberry fields, and also weed management. And strawberry in particular has a lot of information on here, including a bunch of the post-emergent herbicides as well. I'll probably do a talk on that a little later in the season, or possibly in the spring next year when we really start to see a lot of our weed pressure. But in the meantime, I'll go ahead and launch the post-test, and yeah, we can go ahead and just start talking if you got any questions so far from this.